Elderly veteran finds officer tied up and canine collapsed in snow. The secret shocks everyone. The snow was falling sideways, driven by a wind so sharp it felt like glass against the skin. In the heart of the Sawtooth Range, where even birds dared not fly in weather like this. Walter Briggs paused mid-step. His boots sank into the knee-deep drift. But that wasn't what stopped him. The flashlight in his hand had caught something that didn't belong. Two shapes lay half-buried beneath the weight of the storm. One was still, curled unnaturally, arms behind his back. The other, a larger shape, fur-covered, had its head tilted toward the man as if shielding him from the cold. Walter squinted, instinct taking over long before logic kicked in. He moved closer. The man on the ground was young, maybe late 20s, face crusted with ice and blood. His uniform, dark navy with a worn sheriff's patch barely visible under the frost, was torn at the shoulder, hands tied tightly behind his back with paracord. His lips were blue. Beside him, a German shepherd, heavy, sable black and tan, lay unmoving, but not lifeless. Walter saw the ears twitch as the flashlight swept across. The dog's muzzle had been strapped shut with a strip of cloth, legs bound, yet even in collapse, the animal's body was angled toward the officer. Protective. Defiant. A piece of paper flapped above them, pinned to a tree branch with a rusted hunting knife. Walter plucked it loose. The ink was bleeding into the wet fibers, but the words were clear enough. This is what happens to those who don't listen. Walter stared at it for a full second, then another. The wind howled. He tightened his grip on the folding blade in his coat pocket. He didn't need more information. His body already understood. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. This was a message. He knelt beside the officer, checked for a pulse. Faint, but there. Then to the dog. The canine's breathing was shallow. The animal let out a low, strained huff as Walter touched the cords at its legs. Not a growl, more a warning. Even in near unconsciousness, it was still trying to protect its handler. Easy, Walter muttered. I'm not the one you need to worry about. He worked fast. Years in combat zones had trained his hands for worse. The knots were clean. Military. Whoever tied them knew exactly how to restrain someone without killing them. But the storm would have done that job soon enough. The dog whimpered once as the final rope came off its legs. It slumped deeper into the snow, but its eyes never left Walter's face. No trust yet, just measured calculation. Loyalty lived behind those eyes, even in pain. Walter hesitated. He could turn around now. Say it wasn't his problem. No one would blame a 72-year-old veteran for walking away. But the truth gnawed at his gut like old shrapnel. He'd buried men for less. The young officer let out a weak breath. Walter shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around the man's torso. Then, with the kind of strength born from years of necessity, he lifted the dog first. Dead weight, nearly 80 pounds. The shepherd's head lolled onto his shoulder, and for a second, Walter swore he felt the faintest push, like the dog recognized the direction of safety. Step by step, he trudged through the snow, boots punching through the drifts as the trees thinned toward his truck. A decade-old Ford Bronco, battered by time, but always faithful. He lowered the dog into the back, wrapped it in a wool blanket, and left the engine running. Back into the storm. Back for the officer. The younger man was still where he'd been left, his breathing now shallow and ragged. Walter crouched again, slid his arms underneath, and hoisted him up. The cop's head lolled against his chest, a smudge of red on Walter's flannel shirt. No words, just wind. Inside the truck, he laid the man beside the dog. Both unconscious, both barely holding on. For a second Walter looked at them, stranger and shepherd, leaning into each other even now, as if surviving this meant nothing unless they survived it together. Walter slammed the door shut and drove. The snow hit the windshield like sandpaper. Trees lined the narrow road like silent sentinels. The Bronco's heater coughed, then blew warmth. In the rearview mirror, the dog shifted slightly, its head pressing into the officer's shoulder. Walter glanced at them again and felt a strange pull in his chest. He'd come to these mountains to be left alone, to put war behind him. But war had found him anyway. And not the kind with uniforms and front lines, the kind hidden in shadows, buried under trees and snow, dressed like small-town peace and quiet. By the time he reached the cabin, a simple one-room shelter nestled in the woods, the Bronco was nearly buried in white. Walter killed the engine and moved fast. He carried the dog inside first, laying him on a thick quilt near the stove. The heat from the fire hadn't faded. The smell of pine wood and iron clung to the air. Next, the officer, onto the old couch. Walter stripped off the wet jacket, saw the deep purple bruises under the fabric, the torn flesh at the shoulder. He wrapped a towel tight, applied pressure. No questions yet, just survival. The shepherd whined from the floor, lifting his head weakly, eyes locked on the man on the couch. Walter watched them. This unspoken connection, forged clearly in violence and loyalty. And for a brief second, he wasn't in Idaho anymore. He was back in Helmand, in sand and smoke, hearing the same breathing, the same ticking clock. He stepped to the door, bolted it tight, and set the shotgun beside the frame. The cabin creaked with the wind. Outside, the forest moaned. Inside, 3 hearts beat, 2 conscious, 1 watching. Walter knelt beside the dog again, cut away the last of the bindings. The animal flinched, then relaxed, as if realizing that, for tonight, he was safe. "You did good," Walter said softly. The dog didn't move, but his eyes said enough. Walter leaned back, shoulders heavy. He looked at the young man on the couch, pale but alive. Then at the dog who'd refused to abandon him. "This isn't over, is it?" he muttered. The wind outside answered with a howl, and in the quiet warmth of that old cabin, a retired soldier sat between a man nearly killed for knowing too much and a dog who had chosen to protect, even in silence. The cabin door slammed shut behind Walter as he kicked snow from his boots and hauled the unconscious officer through the threshold. The blast of warm air hit him like a wave, pine-scented, smoky, heavy with the scent of burnt coffee and old wood. He laid the young man carefully onto the worn couch, the cushions sagging under his weight. The canine was already inside, curled on a thick wool blanket near the iron stove, steam rising from his damp coat. Walter had thrown 2 more logs into the fire before he went back for the cop, and now the flames were crackling like they had something urgent to say. He knelt beside the officer and started working fast. Boots off, jacket peeled back, shirt ripped down the side to reveal a gash at the shoulder, crusted with blood and gravel. The dog made a low, muffled sound. Walter glanced over. The shepherd's eyes were open. Barely. Still fogged, still bleeding exhaustion. But they were locked onto the man on the couch like a fixed compass. The dog tried to lift his head. Failed, but didn't stop watching. Walter moved toward him next, gently. He retrieved the knife from the counter and returned to cut away the last of the bindings on the animal's legs. His hands hesitated at the knots. Tight, functional, identical. Not civilian rope work. Not the usual duct tape and zip tie job Walter had seen in break-ins or backwoods drunks. These were field ties. Military. Quick release but secure under pressure. Done by someone who'd either served or studied soldiers closely. Walter's mouth went dry. The shepherd winced as the final knot came free. His legs stretched instinctively, stiff from compression. But he didn't flinch when Walter brushed his side with the back of his hand. Instead, he turned his head slightly toward Eric. Yes, the badge still clipped to the torn uniform confirmed the name. Officer Eric Dalton, Blaine County Sheriff's Office. "You're his, aren't you?" Walter muttered. "You stayed." The dog's eyes met his for a second. There was pain there, yes, but also a clarity Walter hadn't seen in any creature, human or animal, for a long time. Shadow. That was the name etched on the black brass plate hanging from his collar. Walter opened his old field kit and pulled out gauze, antiseptic, gloves. His fingers moved automatically, the way they used to back when bleeding and bullets came with the job. He cleaned the gash on Eric's shoulder first, packed it, wrapped it. The officer stirred, a low grunt, escaping his throat. But he didn't wake. Shadow inched closer, dragging his body across the floor until his head rested against the couch's base. His breathing was labored, but his position was deliberate. Close enough that Eric's hand, if he were awake, could have dropped and found familiar fur. That wasn't just loyalty. That was fear and love. Walter paused and looked between the two of them. He didn't know who they were yet, not fully. But whoever left them to die hadn't counted on the dog surviving this long, or the weather holding just enough for Walter to find them. He stood and walked to the window, parted the curtain with 2 fingers. Snow still fell hard, though the wind had calmed slightly. The trees were motionless, holding their secrets. Somewhere out there, the person who wrote that message, the one nailed to the tree, might still be watching. He locked the door. Back at the stove, Shadow let out a soft cough of a whimper. Walter pulled a faded towel from the cabinet and knelt beside the dog again. Carefully, gently, he started drying the shepherd's legs and chest, brushing snow from the fur in circular motions. The dog didn't resist. His muscles were twitching, like his body had finally realized it could rest. "You don't belong in the snow," Walter whispered. "You belong in the fight." He didn't know why he said it. Maybe because he saw something in that dog's body language. Or maybe because some part of him recognized it. The same refusal to give up that had once kept him alive in sand-covered countries no one remembered. Eric shifted on the couch, his lips cracking as they moved. Walter poured hot water into a tin cup, added 2 fingers of honey, and let it cool for a moment before touching the man's mouth with a soaked cloth. A reflexive swallow. Still fighting. In the corner of the cabin, a dusty trunk sat untouched for years. Walter opened it and pulled out an old flannel shirt, a wool blanket, and a canteen. As he moved through the room, preparing small things, he found himself checking the windows again, rechecking the locks. Reflexes didn't die, they just waited. Shadow was still watching Eric. "You didn't leave him," Walter said, almost to himself. "You knew better than to trust the silence." He returned to the couch, rolled Eric slightly to the side, and checked his back. Bruises ran up the spine, fists, maybe boots. Someone had worked him over, but not to kill. They wanted him alive. For now. Walter examined the paracord he'd sliced from Eric's wrists, still damp from snow, fraying at one end. The knots again. Double constrictor. Secure. Efficient. The kind they taught in basic. The kind Walter hadn't seen in years. Whoever did this wasn't guessing. They were sending a message. The dog shifted, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. His head rested against Eric's boot now, one paw tucked beneath his chin. Walter saw the tremble in his flank. Hunger, cold, pain. He placed the tin cup beside the dog, let the scent of honey water drift. Shadow didn't move for it. He wasn't done watching Eric yet. Walter stood again and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. This cabin had always been quiet. He built it for that. But tonight, it was more than quiet. It was waiting. There were questions that needed answers, like why a patrol officer was carrying military-grade bruises, why a canine like Shadow had been restrained so methodically, why someone with combat experience had tried to disappear them both in the snow, and why, above it all, the dog had refused to quit, even when the cold should have taken everything. Walter stared at the stove as the flames licked higher, casting light across the walls, bouncing shadows into motion. Shadow. A name, yes. But more than that, a presence, a warning, a living thread between one man's pain and a secret someone had tried to bury. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. And Shadow wasn't just a survivor. He was the beginning. It was just after dawn when Eric stirred. A pale light seeped through the frosted window panes, casting a silvery haze across the cabin's wooden floor. The fire had died down to glowing embers. Walter had been awake for hours, sitting in the chair by the door, one eye on the window, the other on his guests. The moment Eric's breath hitched, Shadow lifted his head. It was a slow, groggy rise. Eric's eyelids fluttered against swollen skin, his jaw clenched as if dragging himself back from somewhere far. He gasped and tried to sit up, but the pain yanked a sharp sound from his throat. His hand instinctively reached to his side, then flailed, searching. "My phone," he rasped. "Where's my phone?" Walter stood, calm but deliberate. "You didn't have one when I found you." Eric's eyes, bloodshot and glassy, fixed on him. No, it was in my vest, front chest pocket, had everything. I need it." He tried to push himself up again. Shadow, still lying near the couch, let out a soft whine. "Easy, officer," Walter said, crossing the room. "You're still bleeding under those bandages. You stand up too fast, and you're gonna meet my floor the hard way." Eric ignored him. "They have it. They have everything." He looked around the cabin like a trapped animal, his eyes darting from window to door, scanning for escape. Shadow stood slowly, limping on stiff legs, and hobbled toward him. The shepherd's nose touched Eric's outstretched hand. Eric froze. Then slowly, his fingers curled into Shadow's fur. "You're alive," he whispered, voice cracked with disbelief. "You made it." Shadow pressed his head into Eric's lap. His tail gave one soft thump. Walter stayed back, watching the moment unfold. There was something sacred about it, something that didn't need his voice. Eric's hand trembled as he stroked the dog's neck, his voice barely audible. "You chewed through it, didn't you?" "I felt it." "You kept trying." Walter stepped closer, slowly. "Chewed through what?" Eric didn't answer right away. He was somewhere else again, remembering. "We were moving in on a suspected distribution house, just me and Shadow. Small town, no backup within 20 minutes. We'd done it before." He winced, adjusting against the couch, eyes clenched in pain. Turns out it wasn't just a lab. It was a holding site. Stacked crates, guys with military rifles, real hardware. Not junkies with kitchen meth. Organized, trained. Walter felt something shift in his gut. "We got spotted before I even reached the second door." Eric continued. "They hit me from behind. Shadow. He lunged. Took one down. I heard the scream, but there were too many. They beat me until I saw black. I came to, tied up in a truck bed. My sidearm gone. My vest stripped. Shadow was trussed up like an animal. Muzzle, legs, blood in his eyes." Eric's voice cracked. "They kept asking about access codes, where we store evidence, surveillance records, narcotics tracking logs. I didn't say anything." He rubbed his temples with one shaking hand. "They called themselves the Iron Talons. Said they had people inside, high up. One of ours gave them everything, schedule, route, names. I was just clean up." He swallowed hard. "They wanted the files on my phone. I encrypted it, but if they crack it, everything burns." Walter didn't move. He just let the silence settle for a second, let the weight of that name hang in the air. Iron Talons. It sounded made up, except it wasn't. The way Eric said it, low and clenched, it had the smell of truth. "Why leave you in the woods?" Walter finally asked. Eric shrugged weakly. I think someone wanted to make it look like a failed rescue. Maybe they were hoping the snow would finish the job. He looked down at Shadow again. But he didn't stop. Even bound, he pulled at me. Muzzle still strapped shut, legs shaking. He dragged me as far as he could. I blacked out after that. Shadow's eyes didn't leave Eric's face. Not once. Walter leaned back against the wall, folding his arms. What makes you think someone inside your department is dirty? Because we were careful. Real careful. Eric said, I didn't tell anyone about that raid, not even my lieutenant. The only place I logged it was in a secured internal memo, time-stamped. No one should have known, unless someone was watching. Walter didn't reply right away. He knew that kind of betrayal. He'd seen it play out too many years ago, in a different war. He also knew what it felt like when the people who were supposed to protect you became the ones pulling the strings behind your back. Eric wiped at his forehead. The movement was shaky, and his hand came away damp. I don't know how we made it out. I thought we were done. You weren't, Walter said. And neither was he. He nodded toward Shadow. The dog finally lowered himself onto the floor beside the couch again, pressing into Eric's legs like he needed to feel his partner breathing to settle. Walter walked over to the stove and refilled the tin mug with hot water. Drink, he said, setting it within Eric's reach. You're going to need more than adrenaline. Eric lifted it with both hands, grateful but shaky. What's your name? He asked after a long sip. Walter Briggs. Eric tilted his head, recognition flickering. You used to be Army. Walter's jaw worked slightly. Used to be a lot of things. A pause. You believe me? Walter didn't answer at first. Instead, he stepped to the corner of the room, picked up the paracord he'd cut the night before, and held it out. His voice was low, but steady. You don't tie knots like this unless you've been trained. Someone wanted you to disappear without making noise. Someone professional. He nodded toward the dog. But he made noise anyway, even without barking. Eric looked down at Shadow again, voice thick. He saved me. Walter stared at the pair, one man battered but alive, the other limping, still protecting. No, Walter said. He didn't just save you. He walked to the window again, pushed the curtain open with 2 fingers. He brought the war to my front door. And for the first time in over a decade, Walter Briggs didn't feel like a man hiding from his past. He felt like a soldier about to fight again. The snow had hardened overnight, forming a thin crust that cracked underfoot. The morning was cold and clean, the kind of stillness that pressed against your chest like an old memory you couldn't shake. Walter zipped up his field jacket, eyes squinting at the tree line just beyond the cabin. Shadow stood next to Eric, his injured paw wrapped in clean gauze. The shepherd leaned into his handler as Eric adjusted his scarf and checked the mag in his sidearm. The officer still moved slow, ribs taped beneath layers of borrowed flannel, but there was a different set to his shoulders now. Alert, anchored. You sure you're good for this? Walter asked. Eric nodded. He's ready. I go where he goes. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, then turned toward the wind. The dog's nose lifted, sampling the crisp morning air, head angling just slightly to the northeast. Walter didn't need a compass. He knew where they were going. Back to where it started. They took the trail that circled around the ridgeline, careful to keep to the shadows. The sun was up, but the canopy of tall firs filtered it into dull grey stripes. The path was mostly undisturbed except for where Walter had trampled through 2 nights before, with both bodies in tow. There, the snow had partially caved in, the drag marks shallow but still visible beneath the frost. Shadow sniffed slowly, not rushing. His movement was low, deliberate. He paused near the base of a pine tree and turned back toward Eric with a soft huff. "He's got something," Eric said, kneeling. Walter crouched beside them. "What's he tracking?" "Not me, someone else." Shadow moved again, veering off the trail and into the underbrush. They followed, stepping lightly, eyes scanning. Then the dog stopped. His nose pressed to the snow. He began to dig, pawing gently but insistently at a mound of white, crusted with tiny specks of dirt. Walter bent down, brushing aside the snow. Underneath, a faint tire track curved into the clearing. Not from a standard vehicle. Wider than a jeep. Too narrow for a snowplow. The kind of tire that belonged to a military-grade utility truck, or a heavy off-road van. And it hadn't been there for long. Walter ran a hand over the groove, then followed its arc until it disappeared into the trees. "Whoever brought you here didn't walk," he muttered. They drove right up. Shadow kept moving, nose low. 100 feet ahead, the dog paused again. This time, he circled. Sniffed. Barked once, low and clipped. Eric joined him and crouched. There, half buried in frozen mud, was a strip of dark blue nylon, torn at the edge and stained with something reddish-brown. Walter knelt beside him, touched the corner with gloved fingers, then lifted it toward his face. He didn't have to guess. The stench hit hard and fast. "Ammonia," he said, "and bleach, chemical grade." Eric looked up sharply. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Meth." They fell quiet. The wind carried the scent of pine and rot. Somewhere off in the distance, a hawk screamed. "This isn't just a drop site," Eric said slowly. "They're processing out here, or at least staging shipments." Walter nodded. "Using old forest roads. One's not on any GPS. Hell, I helped build some of them when I was stationed in Boise." Shadow barked again, turning sharply to his left. He started walking, limping slightly but determined, nose close to the snow, as he followed a scent invisible to the world. Walter and Eric stayed behind him, guns holstered, hands free, moving like shadows behind the dog that had once been left for dead. About 50 yards out, Shadow stopped cold. He sniffed the air, then growled. Not loud, but sharp, focused. Walter stepped ahead and saw it, just under the branches of a fir tree. A patch of disturbed snow, scattered with small rocks and glinting debris. He bent down, sweeping aside the top layer. Glass vials, burnt foil, a rubber hose. Eric crouched beside him. "Use lab gear. This is where they cooked. Or staged to move it." Walter added. "If they're smart, they don't stay in one place long." "Smart," Eric muttered. "And well-funded. This isn't local junkie tech. These guys are running full ops." Walter straightened, scanning the tree line again. "And if they've got insiders feeding them patrol schedules, they know how to disappear before we call it in." Shadow growled again, low and steady. Eric followed the dog's gaze. There, pressed into the side of a tree, was another mark. This one deliberate. A carved symbol, etched into the bark. A talon, curling around what looked like a badge. The iron talons weren't just criminals. They were making a statement. Walter moved to the tree and stared at the crude etching. His jaw tightened. "This is war," he said quietly. Eric's breath came out white in the cold. "Not the kind we trained for." Walter looked over at Shadow, who was now sitting, watching them both, alert, silent, but present. "No," Walter said, but he did. They headed back to the cabin as the sun climbed above the trees, golden light cutting through the haze. The forest looked peaceful again, hiding what it knew. Shadow didn't limp as much now. The warmth in his stride returned. He trotted a few feet ahead, then circled back, tail stiff, eyes scanning the brush like a second set of ears. Walter felt the shift inside himself. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was engaging. This wasn't about helping a wounded cop or sheltering a battered dog. This was about answering a challenge. A new battlefield, same rules. Move quiet, strike hard, trust the right hands. And trust the dog that never stopped fighting. They didn't speak much on the way back. But every now and then, when Shadow looked back to check if they were still following, Walter gave a silent nod. They were in it now, together. The bell over the old glass door let out a tired chime as Clara Wren stepped into what used to be her father's veterinary clinic. Dust coated the counter, and the air smelled of alcohol wipes and old pine wood. She didn't bother flipping the lights. Sunlight streamed through the cracked blinds well enough. Shadow lay on the padded table near the back, still alert despite his rest. One of his bandages had come loose, and dried blood marked the edge. He didn't flinch when Clara approached. He just watched her, still, present, aware. "I know that look," she whispered, kneeling. "You've seen some bad things, huh?" She slid her fingers gently under the edge of the bandage. Shadow didn't growl, didn't move. He just allowed it. Trusted her. That part always wrecked her, the trust. Animals gave it so freely, even when humans failed them. She worked quietly, wrapping a fresh layer over his wound, checking for signs of infection. The paw was healing, but slow. He'd been pushing too hard too soon, and everyone knew it. Clara just didn't say it aloud. The dog needed purpose. She understood that. More than anyone. Eric stood in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest. "You didn't have to do this." "I did," Clara said without looking up. "You think I'm going to leave a working dog to limp around in some drafty cabin while half this county turns a blind eye to cartel activity?" Walter leaned against the wall, jaw tight. "We didn't exactly plan to involve anyone else." "You didn't involve me," she said, finally rising. "Shadow did." The dog looked up at his name, ears twitching. Clara gave him a small smile, one only animals really understood, a soft apology for all the things she couldn't undo. Eric hesitated. "He trusts you. He knows I lost someone." She replied quietly. "It's in the way we move." Walter's brow furrowed. "You were military?" She shook her head. "No, my brother, Caleb, 6 years younger, rookie narcotics investigator. Took a bad call. Someone inside the department fed intel to the wrong people. He walked into a trap. No vest, no backup. Died in a grocery store parking lot. Shot 3 times before he hit the ground." Silence filled the room. Not the kind people rushed to fill, but the kind that demanded respect. "I stopped trusting systems that day," Clara continued. "Started trusting instincts, especially the 4-legged kind." Eric stepped forward. "We're not sure who we're dealing with. It's not just meth. There's military gear, encrypted radios, routes that don't show up on any map." Clara nodded. "Iron talons. I've heard the name whispered in the ER. Broken noses, stitched mouths. No one talks, but the bruises tell enough." "You ever report it?" Walter asked. "To who?" She snapped. "Half the county's under contract with their security companies. They pay better than the sheriff's office. They own land out east, and their trucks run unmarked. You know how many times I've patched up men who fell off a ladder with steel-toed boot prints on their ribs?" Shadow shifted, nose twitching. He stood, slowly, as if something had clicked in his brain. His body stiffened near the doorframe. Then he moved forward and pawed at a cabinet. Clara frowned. "What is it, boy?" She opened the cabinet. Inside, beneath a box of expired bandages, was a plastic evidence pouch, one she didn't remember putting there. It held a USB stick, the kind used for bodycam downloads. She stared at it. Eric moved beside her. "What is that?" "I don't know. I found Caleb's locker still open the day after the funeral. Some things were missing. But this must have been mixed in. Walter took the pouch and held it up to the light. You think it's from your brother's last shift? Clara nodded slowly. I think it's a reason to stop waiting for justice. Eric pulled out his phone and scanned the room. We'll need a secure laptop. I have one in the back. Clara said, My dad's old records computer. Still runs offline. Shadow had laid back down, but kept one paw stretched toward the cabinet, as if to say, that's not all. Clara knelt again and reached deeper behind the shelves. There, taped to the back panel, was a folded map. Not digital, not printed, hand-drawn, ink fading, roads marked in red pencil, some crossed out, others labelled with names, aliases, perhaps, and coordinates. Walter took one look and said, These are smuggling routes, old surveyor trails. We used some of these in '92 during wildfire evac drills. Eric's voice was grim. Your brother knew something. He found their network. Clara blinked fast, swallowing the lump in her throat. And he died for it. Shadow whined softly. Walter folded the map. We need to move fast. They'll come looking. Let them, Clara said. Eric looked at her. You sure about this? Once we act, there's no turning back. I've already lost my brother. I'm not losing this dog, or either of you. Shadow rose, walked to her side, and leaned against her leg. Walter studied the two of them, a war-scarred shepherd and a woman still burning with grief that never found an outlet. And for the first time, he understood the shape of this fight. It wasn't just about meth or corruption, it was about those left behind, and those who refused to be. They were no longer hiding, they were tracking, and now they had a reason to finish what Caleb started. The map spread across Clara's workbench looked like a child's sketch at first glance. Red lines winding through ridges, blue circles marking trailheads, and a scattering of black X that made no immediate sense. But under Shadow's nose, it became something else entirely. Walter traced a red pencil line through White Elk Ridge. That's not just a trail, that's a drop zone. I've seen those coordinates before, during the Sava Ridge fires. It was one of the few places helicopters could touch down without radio chatter. Clara nodded, flipping through a dusty wildlife reference book. And here, she tapped a page, is the backcountry access road only rangers use. No cameras, no cell signal. It's a ghost path. Eric was quiet. He stood near the window, arms crossed, lips tight. It's more than that. I've seen a convoy go through there, twice, no plates, marked as fire service but with armed escort. Walter glanced up. And you didn't report it? I did, Eric said, to my supervisor. Clara froze. Who's your supervisor? Eric hesitated, then said it. Lieutenant Michael Reeds. The room shifted. A silence hung heavy, broken only by the click of Shadow's claws on the wood floor as he moved to the map again. He sniffed once, then sat. Eric ran a hand over his face. I knew something was off. He always shut down my reports, told me to stick to road patrol, leave interagency stuff to better-trained units. I thought he was just territorial. Clara stared at him. You think Reed sold out? Walter didn't blink. No, I think he is the link. Every time we get close, we hit a wall. He's that wall. They all looked back down at the map. Shadow let out a low growl, not directed at anyone in the room, but as if sensing the shift in purpose. Walter leaned down next to him, eye to eye. You knew before we did, didn't you? Shadow didn't move. He just stared back. Walter straightened. We'll need proof. Something undeniable. Clara opened a drawer and pulled out a small black case. Inside was a collar-mounted camera rig, barely larger than a walnut. Military surplus. My dad used it for trail observation. Short range, Motion activated. Encrypted feed. Eric lifted the device, then glanced at Shadow. You think he'll wear it? He wore worse in the desert, Walter said, kneeling. Didn't you, buddy? Shadow wagged his tail once, then lifted his head like he knew what came next. They fitted the camera snug behind his left ear, adjusted the harness to avoid pressure on his wound. The lens aligned with his line of sight, turning him into more than a tracker. He was now surveillance. Clara tapped her laptop. I can sync it. Short bursts only. If we try full stream, Reed's people will catch the signal. We piggyback off trail cams instead. Bounce feed every 10 minutes. It'll look like wildlife data. Eric crouched beside the dog. You're going in first. No backup, no leash, just instincts. Shadow blinked slowly. His tail tapped twice. He understood enough. They gathered around the map again. The plan was simple, but dangerous. Clara would leak a false report. Injured hiker near Ridge 12, known as a usual drop point. Walter would act as if he'd intercepted radio chatter from an unknown frequency, sharing it by accident during a precinct meeting where Reeds would be present. If Reeds took the bait and tried to reroute or intercept, Shadow's camera would catch him red-handed. But there was one unknown. If Reeds was the mole, he wouldn't come alone. And he wouldn't come quietly. Clara finished syncing the feed. We'll only get one shot at this. Walter nodded. Then we make it count. The next morning came grey and cold. Mist clung to the treetops like waiting breath. Shadow moved through the underbrush without a sound, camera live. The audio buzzed in Clara's earpiece like a mosquito. Static. Then crunches of boots, muffled voices. Shadow stopped near a clearing. 2 black trucks sat half-buried under a camo tarp. Men in fire department jackets, badges not matching any local unit, unloaded duffel bags that clanked like metal. Eric, watching the feed, whispered, "They're armed." One of the men barked orders. The voice was low, confident. Clara's eyes widened. Pause, back it up. Walter scrubbed the feed back 3 seconds. There he was. A man in a sheriff's tactical coat. Face turned slightly toward Shadow's position. Sunglasses, buzz cut, name tag visible. Reeds. Eric leaned in, breath caught. We got him. Walter didn't smile. He didn't blink. Now we draw him out. A new plan formed. Clara would pretend to be a local biologist reporting drone interference. Walter would radio it in. Eric would track the response and stall dispatch just long enough. But just as Clara stood to prep her call, Shadow's feed glitched. Then it froze. Static. Then black. Signal's gone, Clara said. They found him. Eric's face turned pale. No way they spotted that cam. Walter grabbed his coat. Doesn't matter. If they took the collar, they'll try to erase the data. Or worse, Clara whispered. They'll try to erase him. Eric was already moving toward the door. Then we don't wait. We go now. And outside, the wind picked up. Somewhere in the forest, Shadow was still moving. Off-leash, off-script, hunted now. But not alone. Not yet. The morning was too still. A hush blanketed the cabin like thick wool, muting even the usual clicks of Clara's keyboard and the soft rhythm of Shadow's breath. Outside, fresh snow lay untouched, flawless. A postcard scene, but something about it made Walter's jaw clench. Shadow had been pacing since sunrise, nose low to the ground, then snapping his head toward the tree line, ears perked. Not a bark, just tension, coiled, humming. Clara poured coffee, still distracted by the failed camera feed from the night before. Maybe the collar's just dead. Batteries could have frozen. Shadow froze. One paw lifted off the ground. Then he let out a low, guttural growl, deep from the belly. Not aggression. Warning. Walter was already moving. Clara, get down. What? Down! Eric grabbed her by the arm and yanked her behind the old cast-iron stove just as Shadow lunged at the door, not to attack, but to block it, body rigid. His nose pressed to the lower seam. He let out a short huff, then backed away 3 precise steps. Walter's voice was barely a whisper. Tripwire. Clara blinked. What? He smells plastic explosives. Snow exploded. The front porch detonated in a flash of white and splintered wood, sending the door crashing inward and smoke pouring into the room. The concussion slammed through the walls like a hammer, but Shadow had already knocked Clara to the floor with his body, shielding her. Footsteps outside. Multiple. 3, maybe 4, Eric hissed, crawling to the window, sidearm drawn. Walter didn't respond. He moved with an old familiarity, retrieving a duffel from the closet. Inside, a sidearm, a combat knife, and a rusted shortwave radio. He flicked the power, static. Then a voice, crackling, curt. Cabin confirmed. Move in. No survivors. Clara's blood turned to ice. They weren't there to threaten. They were there to erase. Shadow growled again, then sprinted toward the back hallway, turned sharply, and vanished through the utility room door. Seconds later, a thud. Clara scrambled after him. "Shadow! Stay back!" Walter ordered. But it was too late. Shadow had launched through the rear dog flap, one they never locked, and was already gone, slicing across the snow like a shadow himself, head low, tail stiff. He circled wide. The men moved in from the front, weapons drawn, black gear blending with the trees. But they didn't see what was behind them. Shadow lunged from the blind side, jaws clamping around the calf of the last man in the formation. The scream was sharp, followed by a gunshot. Missed. Walter took the cue, kicked the busted door fully open and fired once. Center mass. One attacker dropped. Eric rolled out from the side window, caught another off guard, and took him down with a tackle in the snow. They wrestled. Snow turned crimson. Eric came up bleeding from the lip, but still fighting. The final man raised his weapon toward the cabin. Clara screamed. Then Shadow hit him again. This time, full force, snarling, dragging him to the ground before he could pull the trigger. Teeth met flesh. The rifle skidded across the ice. Walter moved fast. Gun to temple. Don't! The man froze. Clara grabbed zip ties from her emergency kit, hands shaking. They secured the attacker against the porch railing, breath fogging in heavy gasps. "You military?" Walter asked. The man spat blood. "Private sector. Who sent you?" Silence. Shadow snarled. Walter cocked his weapon. The man broke. "Reeds! He said there was a leak. Said we were cleaning up loose ends." Eric's face twisted. He sent a kill team. The man gave a weak, bloody smile. "You think this is the only team?" Walter's fist connected with his jaw. The man slumped. Inside, Clara was shaking as she treated Eric's cut. Her fingers trembled, not from cold. "I thought this place was off-grid. Safe." Walter checked the radio. It was, until someone fed them coordinates. He looked at the attacker, unconscious in the snow. They were listening all along. Shadow came back, blood on his shoulder, panting but alert. He leaned into Clara's side, grounding her. Her hand found his fur, gripped it like a lifeline. Walter went silent. "Clara," he said finally, "we need to move. Tonight. But where? We're not hiding anymore." He looked at Eric. "You still have Reed's patrol schedules?" Eric nodded slowly. "Yeah, why?" Walter turned to Shadow. "You up for one more hunt?" Shadow raised his head and barked once. Not as a warning. As a promise. Snow crunched under Shadow's paws, but he didn't slow down. Not even with the limp. Eric had tried to stop him back at the truck, kneeling down in the dark to touch the old scar on the shepherd's hind leg. You're not built for this anymore, buddy. Shadow stared back, not with defiance, with purpose. Then turned toward the tracks and started walking. Now, in the dead of night, they followed him in silence. Walter moved like he used to, every motion deliberate, scanning rooftops and shadows. Clara clutched a small tablet that tracked the camera on Shadow's collar, blinking green as he moved closer to the warehouse district. A line of rusted rail cars stood like ghosts in the dark. Behind them, 2 black SUVs with FBI, insignia sat engine off. Backup. Real backup this time. Agent Laurie Jenkins, tall and lean in tactical black, leaned toward Walter. You sure about this tip? This isn't how we do it. Walter nodded at Shadow ahead. He's not guessing. The dog stopped at a chain-link gate, nose up, sniffed the air, then he growled. Deep! Barely audible. But final. Warehouse 17, the same location that matched Eric's decrypted drive from the last raid. The dots had aligned. Human trafficking hub disguised as a freight shipment center. And Michael Reed's, Lieutenant Reed's, was the rot at the center. Laurie spoke into her mic. Alpha team move to northeast corner. Bravo to south entrance. Hold for green light. From the van, Clara patched into the interior feed. Shadow's collar sent back. Grainy infrared video. Shapes moving inside. Flashes of motion. Kids. Small bodies. At least 5 of them huddled in the back corner of the building, locked in what looked like a modified livestock pen. Jesus, Clara whispered. Eric cocked his rifle. We're not waiting. Walter raised a hand. We wait until he finds Reed's. Inside the warehouse, Shadow crept low. Silent. One paw at a time. The camera on his collar showed rows of crates, narrow corridors. Voices, one man's, loud and cruel, ordering another to prep the next batch. Then another voice, familiar, Michael Reed's. He was arguing with someone. About the cleanup going sideways, about needing leverage. Then, suddenly, the screen on Clara's tablet jolted. Shadow had stopped, just behind a stack of pallets, and there he was. Reed's, holding a small boy by the collar of his jacket, dragging him like a rag doll. Let's see them shoot if I've got this one. Reed snarled. Walter's jaw locked. Go! Explosions of motion. Flashbangs broke the night. Doors crashed in on both sides. Inside, chaos erupted. Reed spun, grabbed the child, and raised his weapon to the boy's head. Back off! I swear to God! But he never finished the sentence. Shadow launched. Not from the side, from above. He had climbed a stack of crates silently while the chaos started, positioned himself just above Reed's blind spot. The shepherd dropped like a missile. All 90 pounds of muscle and fury hit Reed square in the shoulders. The boy dropped. Reed's hit the floor hard, gun clattering away. Shadow didn't let go. Teeth locked around the man's forearm, pinning him, snarling. Reed's screamed. Then the lights came on. FBI agents poured in. The kids were pulled from their cages, wrapped in jackets, led out. Walter knelt by Shadow, who stood over the now handcuffed Reeds, chest heaving, but calm, still alert. You saved him, Walter said softly, hand resting on Shadow's neck. Again. Reeds groaned. He's just a dog. Clara stepped up. No, he's the reason you're not holding that boy's corpse right now. Eric cuffed Reeds tighter, forcing him up. How long? How long were you running this? Reed spat blood. Long enough to know no one was going to stop me. Shadow growled. Reeds flinched. You were wrong. Walter said. He stopped you. Later, as the kids were loaded into warm vans and driven away, one of them, no older than 8, ran back. He crouched down beside Shadow, who sat alert, but calm, ears high. The boy reached out, touched his fur. Thank you, he whispered, then looked up at Clara. Is he going to be okay? Clara swallowed hard. Yeah, he always is. Shadow turned to watch the vans disappear into the snow, and for the first time in weeks he laid down, not out of exhaustion, but peace. Morning light filtered through the tall pines of Sawtooth Ridge, cutting soft, golden streaks across the snow-dusted cabin porch. A breeze moved gently through the trees, as if the forest itself was finally exhaling. Shadow lay at the edge of the wooden steps, head up, ears relaxed but alert. He had barely left that spot since the night of the raid, as if guarding something deeper than territory, something like peace. Walter stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee, steam rising into the crisp mountain air. He set one down on the railing. The other he held in both hands, warming fingers that had gripped too many memories. "You still don't like the spotlight," he murmured to the dog. Shadow blinked slowly, then looked out towards the tree line again. Down in Boise, they were calling him a hero. The media had descended on the cabin days after the warehouse raid. They came in pairs and vans, microphones and lenses, all wanting a glimpse of the lone handler who broke the case and the combat canine who never quit. The governor had called. Twice. The FBI issued official commendations. Walter hadn't answered the first call, or the second. But when they arrived, cameras, questions, rehearsed sympathy, Shadow had simply walked out of the cabin, sat beside Walter, and stared at them. Still, quiet, dignified. And in that silence they understood. This wasn't a war story for prime time. It was a life and a cost. Back in town, they labeled Walter the unsung hero of Sawtooth, a headline he never read. Eric stood beside the cabin's woodpile, chopping kindling with cleaner swings than before. He had rejoined the Marshal Service, but on his terms. After the Reed's operation was made public, the review board reinstated him with a quiet apology. He didn't want a promotion, just a second chance. Clara, on the other hand, had turned down 2 research grants to stay in Idaho. "I'm not running a lab in New York while this place still needs watching," she told Walter. "And besides, you're a terrible cook. Someone's got to keep you alive." With the reward money and a grant secured by Senator Bell herself, Clara launched the official Sawtooth Wildlife and Rescue Center. No more hidden cabins, no more hacking together treatment for injured. Wolves with borrowed syringes. Shadow helped too, not with scalpel or software, but with presence. He became the quiet heartbeat of the place. When new rangers visited, they watched how Shadow moved, how he listened. If a wounded animal growled in pain, Shadow would lie nearby, tail still, offering no threat, only understanding. The medal came 2 weeks after the rescue. A polished brass disc engraved with a silhouette of a shepherd, inlaid with stars. They called it the National Canine Valor Award. A colonel in dress blues had driven up from Fort Carson to deliver it in person. Shadow sat for the photo. Stoic, proud. But when the camera clicked, he looked away, toward Walter, not the medal. Later, Walter hung it in the cabin hallway, next to an old photo from Afghanistan. A different war, a different dog. That night, as the fire crackled low, Clara curled up with a blanket, watching snow fall outside the window. "Do you ever think he knew it would end this way?" she asked quietly. Walter shook his head. He didn't care how it ended, just where he needed to be. Outside, a fox darted past the edge of the clearing. Shadow didn't chase, just watched, then rested his head on his paws. Something in the forest had shifted, not just because evil had been stopped, but because good had been allowed to stay. Later that week, the town held a small ceremony in the old school auditorium. Kids from the shelter, the ones they rescued, were there, holding drawings. One boy walked up to the front, holding a sketch of Shadow beside a giant pine tree. "This dog saved my life," he said into the microphone, his voice trembling. But he also saved my big sister, and me, and other kids you don't know." He paused, looked down at Shadow, seated quietly near the stage. And he didn't even ask for anything. A murmur moved through the crowd. Then silence. Then applause. Walter and Shadow left before the cake was served. Neither liked crowds. Back at the cabin, Walter tossed a worn tennis ball into the woods. Shadow chased it, not with the force of a young soldier, but with the calm grace of a dog who knew exactly where he belonged. When he returned, dropping the ball at Walter's feet, the old man sat on the step and scratched behind his ear. No orders, no missions, no battles left. Shadow closed his eyes and stayed. The cabin hadn't changed much. A new coat of paint clung to the siding like a promise, and the porch steps had been replaced after last winter's ice nearly took them out. But the bones of the place remained. Same creaking boards, same coffee-stained rocking chair, same worn mat where Shadow always lay, stretched long beneath the morning sun. Walter sat on the porch, one leg crossed over the other, Mug resting on his knee. His face had a few more lines now, his beard a little grayer, but his eyes still held that sharpness, the kind earned, not inherited. Shadow was there too. 1 year later, and he still rose, at dawn without being called. He still patrolled the edge of the woods out of habit, even though the danger was gone, and he still returned to that porch like clockwork, as if drawn by something deeper than duty. A gravel crunch echoed from the drive. Walter looked up. A beat-up hatchback stopped just short of the pines. Out stepped a young woman, early 20s maybe, thin notepads tucked under one arm, DSLR hanging from her neck. She waved awkwardly. "You must be Walter," she said, climbing the steps carefully. "I'm Dana Reeves. I'm a journalism student at Boise State, doing a senior project on canine veterans and the humans they choose." Walter raised a brow. "Choose?" She smiled. "Well, most dogs follow commands, but I've read that Shadow chose to stay here. After all the press, the offers from Washington, he could have been in any house in the country. But he didn't leave." Shadow opened one eye, as if aware they were talking about him, then closed it again. Dana sat down a respectful distance away and pulled out her recorder. "So, why do you think the dog stayed here?" Walter didn't answer right away. He reached down, fingers brushing the fur behind Shadow's ear. The shepherd leaned slightly into the touch, like he always did. "Because," Walter said finally, voice low. He saw the truth before anyone else did. Dinah looked up, puzzled. "The truth?" Walter nodded slowly. "About this place. About me. About the kids we found." He knew what was broken before the rest of us were even willing to admit it. He took a sip from the mug. And more than that, he stayed because he still had something to fix. Loyalty like that. It doesn't care what the world says. It only listens to what matters. Dana didn't speak for a moment. The wind moved gently through the pines, casting light and shadow across the porch. She adjusted her camera, then quietly snapped a photo, Walter's hand resting on Shadow's side, the mountains stretched out behind them. A picture that didn't need captions. As she gathered her things, Dana hesitated. "You think he'll stay here forever?" Walter smiled. "Shadow? He's already home." The next morning, the article went live. It wasn't flashy. No viral headlines, no war zone montages. Just one quiet photograph and a quote that rippled through corners of the internet like a whisper. He saw the truth before anyone else did. Veterans commented, survivors commented, dog lovers, rangers, kids, people who had lost, people who had found something again. And under the photo, pinned by the author, was a question. What's your story with a loyal pet, if you've ever loved a dog or been saved by one in ways you didn't expect? We'd love to hear from you. Shadow's story isn't just his. It belongs to all of us who know that loyalty doesn't bark for attention. It waits quietly in the shadows and shows up when the world falls apart. Like, comment below and share your story. And if you believe German Shepherds deserve their place in the heart of America, hit subscribe. Because some heroes don't wear uniforms, they just never leave.